Hi guys, welcome to another painting walkthrough. This is for my image that I've titled City Behind Us. So you see I'm using my primer brush just to lay down some colours using the Neon Pastels colour palette. Remember, you can download that from this Patreon page, so make sure you get a hold of it. So I'm just using the oil brush just to my organic mixer, so it's kind of like an oil brush, but it says a mixer brush, so I'm just using that to blend some of those colours in. Start by painting in some rough characters about where I want, just to get an idea. Again, I don't really have much of a clue of what I'm going to do. I just pick the brush and I start painting something in the darker colour for the foreground, because I kind of know that I want the character to be in silhouette. And then it starts to form into something, and I go, okay, that sort of looks like where the character would be. I wanted to try actually something with a much more interesting angle, and so that's why I raised the horizon quite a lot to make the angle look upwards. Then I used Adobe Stock because I'd drawn a bike. I kind of thought, oh, okay, let's go and have a look at some bike images on Adobe Stock, and I found this particular image here, so I brought it in. It's actually a completely different angle to the one I'd painted. But really, it was just about giving me the idea. So then I just sort of start painting in parts of the silhouette of the bike, tracing over the character just to make it less like this whichever character, that sort of traditional biker, and turn it into the character Anya, which I've been developing, and have her sitting on the bike. And by this point, you can start to see I've got a clearer idea of what's going on in the image, and there's more of a story. Starting to paint the cat in here. You probably realise from some of my earlier videos when I talk about when I paint the cat is that I usually don't often use a reference for the cat. For some reason, when I start sketching the cat, it kind of works out. Maybe because I observe cats quite a bit, so I probably have a bit of an idea. However, on this one thing I definitely struggled with was the face, which you'll find out how I deal with that a little bit later. Painting this really bright light, because one thing I wanted was that to be almost like a focal point. Obviously the main focal point, you kind of go in through Anya on the bike. You got the cat slightly more in the foreground, and the city plays a backdrop. But I wanted this light just to really draw your attention in. So I didn't want it just to be a small glowing light. I wanted it to be a bright beaming light. So I've just used the brush to just swipe right across the painting there. Painting in the face, same with the last painting that I'd done of Anya, which was the one of her racing through the city streets. I wanted to paint the face from a distance. I didn't want to go in too close. That makes it quite fiddly because I'm using a Huion tablet, the Inspiroi Q11. So it's a tablet that sits on my desk. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between me painting what's on the desk or drawing on the desk and then what I'm seeing on the screen. So it's a bit fiddly. But in a way, it's a good discipline because it limits me from putting too much detail into the face. However, it can often look a little bit cartoony because there's not enough difference between shadow and light. So that's one thing I need to be a bit careful of. But I've kept it out at this zoomed out level so that I can get a holistic picture of the painting and not zoom in too close and then sort of fiddle around with it and then zoom back out and then not know the difference that detail's made, and there's a disconnect between the tiny amount of detail that I've done and the whole painting. So that's why I've started painting from a distance. So adding in some of the highlight there from the beam of light from the bike onto the cat. Adding in the shading of the clothes now. Adding a bit more detail from the bike back in. So from that image, there was a few sort of like springs and little bits of detail. And bringing that image back in is just a good way of getting those tiny little details, which I can't really fathom in the painting. Just bringing those in and just making them make the bike look a little bit more dense in terms of its mechanics and stuff like that. Adding the creases to the clothes. One thing that is difficult with these that's supposed to be kind of leathery clothes, biker clothes, is getting the creases right. You can see I'm still playing with trying to add a bit more detail into the wheels there. and the handlebars. I bring in another bike here because I start to play with seeing if this wheel works. So this is, if you recognize this image, I used it on the last painting. So I brought that in just to try and match the detail on the last bike, because they're two different bikes. So I wanted to make sure it's got that little grill on the side that wraps around the body. So I've just brought that in, and the light looks a lot better as well. Again, as always, added a quick paint daubs filter in Photoshop, and then blended it in with the blending mode. Doing the same with the detail of the tyre here as well. Obviously then I paint back over it just to make sure that it matches the rest of the painting. It has that painterly look. Last thing I really want is, and something I don't like about some paintings actually when I look at them, is when some digital paintings, is when you can see that they've brought in real imagery, but they haven't blended it in with the painting. So there's some bits that look almost completely photorealistic, and then some bits that look very painterly, and I'm not personally a fan of that, and so I'm trying to avoid doing that. So that's why I always make sure I paint roughly over the top of those images that I bring in. Using my angle brush to paint in the hair there, making sure it kind of wraps around the head. And I think one thing about hair is just to make sure it looks like it falls properly. It's very difficult getting hair right, because sometimes, you know, I've painted hair where it looks like it's defying gravity, and not in a kind of gel-like way, but in a kind of like it's been frozen in time. So I really need to make sure I'm making the hair fall properly, and so that's what a lot of these sweeping curves that I do when I'm drawing the hair help to make it feel like it's falling, rather than drawing the detail of the hair. Using some of my custom shapes here, they don't necessarily work here because there's probably a little bit too much detail for that backdrop, and I think I end up making sure that the background is very rough. Using my custom shapes here on these city buildings and the architecture helps to give it form and shape, but the problem with detail is the further you go away from the viewer, the less detail there should be. So there's a little bit of a mistake using those. So you can see that the thing with the most detail, but especially by the end of the painting, you'll see is the cat. It's got the most detail in it because it's the closest thing. And as it gets further away from the cat, there's less and less detail. Bringing a couple of images here as well, just to try and mix them in, to try and switch up the architecture in the background. So if you notice, I use my flat brush, and if you've watched my tutorial on it, on this page, you'll see that I use my flat brush for doing a lot of the architecture, just so that I can quickly get an idea of buildings and shapes, and the lights that they're putting out. But sometimes that can make a lot of the buildings look the same, so I bring in images and use some of my custom shapes to try and make it feel a bit more, give there a bit more variety to the architecture. Using my hard flat brush here just to add in the neon lights, some of the signs, particularly towards the bottom of the street. Trying to make it look like there's a lot of neon signs there. Adding a bit more glow with the airbrush dodger. So it's basically I put it on a new layer, change the blending mode to color dodge, and then it's just a soft brush basically that I just pick, kind of like, let's say I want to make this, obviously you can see I wanted to make the light glow a little bit. I don't pick the same color as the light. I pick a more a darker, maybe a little bit more saturated version of that color. Sorry, a little more desaturated version of that color, and then paint over the top with this color dodge mode, and it just brightens that whole area and just makes it glow. Here I'm trying to add a bit more, again, probably too much detail to that image, to that building in the back. So I'll put a bit of text on there, but I think by the end of it, you probably see that most of it disappears. I have to change it to some, I believe this is Korean text, which spells District 8, I believe. Excuse my ignorance if I've got that wrong. I do apologise. So what I've used here is I bought an image of a cityscape, which you saw earlier. Changed the blending mode to something like screen, I believe. and then got rid of all the dark areas, and then just hopefully the glowing lights just shine through. And that can be quite a good technique when you're trying to have a bit of variety in the lights. You can see I often use my flat brush to do the lights, but having those dotted lights can help, and bringing in images with some stock images with city lights in there already can just help you give a more even pacing and placing to the lights, so they're not all blocked up in one area or they look too like overly bright. See, I have a bit of a problem with the face here. So this is because I'm on the, on a, as you can see at the bottom, 50% zoom. So I'm looking at my screen, and I've got quite a big screen. I've got the iMac 28 inch, I believe. I think it's 28 inch screen. So it's quite a big screen, but that face is very, very small. So trying to get the detail in can be difficult. But what was good is you saw I drew the face too big. Because I was on that zoomed out level, I saw instantly when I saw it in relation to the rest of the painting, oh, that's way too big. Often what would happen in my earlier days is I'd zoom right in, paint the face, it'd be perfect, and then I'd zoom out and the face is huge and it's completely out of proportion with everything else. So that's one of the benefits. But still very, very fiddly. It's really, really fiddly stuff this is. And I'm not sure I'll always do this. I think it's really just a discipline thing for me. I think when I get more disciplined with it, then I can start zooming back in and understand that it doesn't need that much detail depending on how big the face is. You can see the cat's face here at the moment it really looks cartoony. It just doesn't match, and so I'll deal with that later. Still messing with the shading on Anya's face here. If you watched my Halloween painting, you'll see that I'm kind of using a similar lighting technique in terms of how the light hits that face. I think because I've learnt it, I'm trying to re-employ it almost to just solidify it in my mind. So it's just getting practice really, because I know obviously the light is coming from a similar place, and so I know that how the shadow is going to hit. I really actually had fun painting the ground on this one because it didn't require a lot of detail, and it just was about being creative and just laying down this kind of colour, and it almost feels like a reflective sort of surface. So it's quite nice to do. Bringing in a bit of an image here that I often use for Anya's jacket. It's this stock image of a robot that I use for her jacket to get me a bit of detail in there. But if you notice, I end up kind of getting rid of it and then just painting over the top of it. In my very initial painting, I didn't do that. In my very first painting that I did of Anya, it was very much trying to be photorealistic, and so I didn't really paint over a lot of stuff. You can see I've made the hair a little bit more dense now. Another thing that has makes a big difference in your paintings is just really understanding the difference between light and dark, and knowing where there is no light whatsoever and where there is complete and almost overexposed light, and knowing the subtleties between it, and knowing when to just go to call it and say this is just going to be a completely dark shadow, this is going to be completely bright, and almost having the confidence not in some cases not to have a gradient, because some shadows are harsh. Sometimes when I've painted the paintings I don't like, which I don't often share, they're almost the practice warm-up paintings, I've got way too much of a gradient between colours, so everything looks really smooth, and that's where it has a really digital art look. And so one thing I'm really trying to practice is just being confident in just laying down paint without feeling the need to just overly blend it. Here you can see I had a lot of problem. I tried to do a different face there and it just didn't work out, so I got rid of that one. Again, as you always see me do, I play with a few bits of colour balance and hue changes as well. I think this is the moment I'm just sizing it up. Sometimes you'll see that I'm just sitting there, and if you watch some of the real-time paintings, I leave those in where I just sit there looking at the painting, not doing anything, thinking, is it right? Is it not right? And just giving myself that time to observe the image, almost as an outsider as much as possible. And sometimes it's because I've gone away and maybe come back the next day and I just sit there, I start recording and I sit there and I look at it and I think, what could I do? What needs doing? Here's a process you often see me do, is adding the camera raw filter towards the end. There's me signing it. The camera raw filter really just gives me a little bit more sharpening to it. So here you can see I really struggled with the cat's face. So what I did is I got in a stock image of a cat that was a similar position, resized it and then painted over it. And actually straight away you can start to see that cat's face is just way more believable. It doesn't look like a cartoon anymore. Still painterly, but it feels like a real cat and not a make-believe cartoon cat. One thing I often do towards the end of a painting is I fiddle like there's no tomorrow. I mean, I'm constantly looking at it thinking, is that right? Is that right? Seeing loads of minor details that actually most people won't see the difference. But to me, it becomes so glaringly obvious that I can't take my eye off it because I've noticed it. So I end up fiddling a lot with it. Well, there you go. There's the end painting. Hope you like it. I'm actually particularly proud of this one. I like the angle more than anything. So I'm trying to play with angles like this a little bit more. Hope you liked it, and I'll see you on the next one.